today I'm going to talk to you about air cargo. It's often quite an overlooked area of the industry. My name's Tracy. I'm a senior lecturer in the aviation department within GSBL at London Metropolitan University. I'm going to be focusing on cargo because it's quite often one of the most overlooked areas of the industry, yet one of the most dynamic and exciting. It's much more than boxes. It's about getting the right freight to the right place in the right quantity, in the right condition, and the best conditions possible. What I'd like to do first of all is just go through the teaching team with you. We have the aviation management team headed up by Washington, who's the course leader, and then there's myself, Tracy. I'm a senior lecturer, and then there's Nick Coleman, who's also a senior lecturer, and our newest member of staff called Sarika, who's a lecturer within the aviation teaching team. Myself, Nick and Washington have been teaching here for approximately 20 years together, so we've got quite a lot of education background, but previous to that we had quite a lot of industry experience. I've got 12 years in industry, working predominantly in aviation risk management, but started off my career in air cargo. Nick has his specialism in strategic planning and marketing, and Washington is a trained pilot, but also heads up the finance modules and the aviation risk modules. So that's a little bit about ourselves and the teaching team. I also just wanted to go through with you some of the core modules because although they're currently up on the website, we are going through a curriculum review, and in September they will be changing. So I just wanted to bring your attention to the changes we're implementing. One of the new modules that we're bringing in is called aviation system. So the introduction to the aviation system gives you an overview of the terminology and the governing bodies within aviation that are quite important, and gives you underpinning knowledge about the general way of operating airports and airlines, so that you're more familiar with it as you go into the new modules that you'll be encountering on the course. The other new module that we'll be having is the introduction to air transport economics. It will be in the second semester, so in the spring term, and this module gives you an overview of how airlines and airports price their products, and also the nature of costs that are quite specific to the aviation industry. So we felt that the introduction of those two core modules would be quite important to your studies. Moving into level 5 and level 6, you have the option to tailor your course somewhat specifically as your career aspirations develop. You'll be able to hone your specialist knowledge a little bit more. So that's a quick speed through the course, as it were. Just to get you a little bit excited about what we do, and to give you an indication about the support that we have. We're well known within the university for doing quite a number of diverse field trips. So we've recently come back from Dubai, where we visited Emirates and Etihad. We alternate these big field trips overseas. Sometimes we go to Canada because that's where the international head offices are for some of the governing bodies within aviation. We have been in the past to Boeing at Seattle. We have been twice now to Toulouse, to the Airbus factory, and we have been to Schiphol to see the cargo facilities there. We have an ongoing relationship with London City. Quite a lot of our alumni are at London City airports, so in various roles, airside and landside. So we've got quite a lot of field trips going on there. So we're quite dynamic, and we do get out and about. And linked in with this is the Aviation Society, who organise guest speakers and networking events. The Aviation Society is headed up by students and run by students with no teacher support. And this again is quite successful, and it adds another dimension to your course. You also have the usual student union, student representatives and academic mentors if you need help from an academic perspective. Okay, so I'm now going to talk to you about how busy the world of aviation is. Apologies for the date of this video, but this is provided by National air traffic control services. They haven't done another one like it, but I just like this as it gives you an overview of quite how crowded the skies are, but also from this you can then see how big a contributor aviation and air cargo is to the sector itself. Okay, having watched the video, you can see quite how busy the skies of London are, and if you replicate that across the UK generally and across Europe, you can just see how much of a contribution air cargo makes. So no other industry facilitates and drives international trade as much as air cargo, but unfortunately up until recently it has remained in the shadows of the air passenger industry. This is because fundamentally the perception of the passenger side of the business is much more sexy, for want of a better word, and the air cargo industry gets kind of forgotten, and because of that there's been a lack of investment, a lack of facility investment, but also a lack of people investment. But there's a lot of staff that are not attracted to the aviation cargo industry, and this lack of talent is proving a problem for driving the industry forward. So that's one of the big problems that aviation cargo industry has. In order to drive the profitability of cargo, we need to make practical decisions about what type of airports and airlines we invest in, what kind of aircraft we invest in, and investing in the right facilities to try and future-proof the air cargo industry. This will be things like cold storage for perishable items, for example, and biometric security, and investing in big security devices to make sure that air cargo on a big scale is securely transported. So the problem with this is the fact that in comparison to other industries, air cargo doesn't return as much on investment as, say, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, where the returns on investment are approximately 25%, whereas in the air cargo industry is around about 6%. And this generic lack of attraction to investors is making the appropriation of funds quite difficult. Leading on to that, you've got the increased focus on sustainability. People often think of sustainability in terms of the environmental perspectives, but it's also about the longevity of the product, the business model as well. And there's a lot of focus on regulations to do with environmental laws, for example, and environmental policies, and air cargo is perceived to be a big contributor to pollution, amongst other things. So finding ways that drive sustainability initiatives against a backdrop of a lack of investment is actually quite difficult. And as I alluded to before, the people element is a real imperative for developing and driving air cargo, because attracting the right people at the right location is proving quite difficult. Okay, so we go on to definitions. What is cargo? Cargo is anything that's basically in a box. When I say that loosely, it's on a pallet. You can have wooden pallets or metal unit load devices, and anything that is mail and any excess baggage that passengers generate, for example, skis, surfboards, etc., etc. So logistics is defined as the movement and storage from origin. So if we were based in London, that would be the origin point would be London Heathrow, and through to the goods being transported and delivered through to the final consumer. We do have an industry body that represents us in air cargo. One of the most prolific is CILT, which stands for the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. And they've got quite a good definition, which I like, which appears on the surface to be quite straightforward. But if you break it down, it's actually quite, there's quite a lot of components. So getting the right product to the right place. Well, the world's a very, very big place. And I remember very early in my career that I cost my company a lot of money by transporting some heavy agricultural plant equipment to somewhere with a very similar code, airport code in America. And I ended up transporting it to the middle of nowhere in America, and it should have been in Miami. And the cost of getting it from one place to the other in America was phenomenal. So getting the right product, the right freight in the right place is actually quite difficult. And then in the right time, this is important. The aviation industry is renowned for delays and problems, and the average time that a piece of cargo spends on the ground, that's called a dwell time, is approximately 6 hours. So a lot can happen to freight in 6 hours. If you're transporting something from London Heathrow through to Africa, for example, you've got to monitor the temperature, you've got to make sure that the conditions are right. There are all sorts of handling issues and storage issues, so it's a very complex operation. And then in the best condition possible, if you imagine that cargo gets handled from the person that produces it through to the truck that takes it through to the airport, through to the actual airport itself, onto the plane, and then the same in reverse. It gets handled quite a lot of times, so the susceptibility to damage is actually quite high. So these factors have to be put into consideration. And the last bit, which is where the economics module kind of comes into play, is at an acceptable cost. Without going into too much detail, not very much of the world's freight is air freighted. Only about 3% of the world's freight is air freighted. Most of it goes by sea freight. That's a much longer process, typically between 6 and 8 weeks, but much, much cheaper. If you're thinking about what type of goods the aviation industry sends across the globe, it tends to be high value perishable goods. And if you're thinking about that in relation to costs, if you're having your strawberries produced in Italy and then they come to the supermarket in Sainsbury's, there's a top price to what you're willing to pay for that, but these have to be air freighted. So the cost of handling, storage, the fuel of the aircraft, etc., if these costs become too much, you begin to hit what we call a ceiling price. And so these costs are something that very much need to be considered within an aviation context. Okay, so we talk about what is cargo, and this short video will very briefly go through the mechanisms by which cargo is transported and loaded onto an aircraft. So what you can see in front of you is a driver driving some form of forklift truck with in the foreground, it's called a unit load device. These are metal devices where lots and lots of boxes are put into a bigger box and transported back onto the plane. The box behind is not put into a metal box. These are just stacked on top of one another and made immovable by the fibre netting put across it and then wrapped in some form of plastic wrapping. As the video goes on, you will see things called scissor lifts. You'll see roller beds on the aircraft floor. This helps the freight to move and be positioned. But we'll explain these in much more detail as the module progresses. This just gives you an overview of how freight is handled and how many times it's handled. Okay, I'm now going to talk about top cargo airlines. Contrary to popular belief, these are not mostly American or European. You can see that the geopolitical centre of cargo has significantly changed in the last 10 years, and it's now much more Emirates, Asia focused. If you think about it logically, places like Qatar, places like Doha and Dubai, these places are driving a lot of investment into cargo and aviation in general. They don't have the planning restrictions, so can build big hubs, big airport infrastructure, warehouses, etc. So this is just something to think about, just to change your perceptions and perhaps that you have of the industry. In terms of types of airlines, you have a passenger aircraft that carries freight. This is the cheaper option for transporting freight because much of the costs are borne by the passenger and very little of the aircraft is actually taken up by freight itself. The restriction is that the route is dictated by the passenger demand on which routes the passengers are going. Then you have a combi aircraft. This is much more weighted towards cargo, so much more of the space in the aircraft is devoted to cargo. Tends to be 50-50, but deviations around that. Then you have your freighter aircraft. These are for things that are Well, first of all, it's only air cargo that tends to be placed on those freighter aircraft. So therefore, the routes are dictated to where the demand for cargo is rather than the demand for passenger. Things on these freighter aircraft will be things like tigers, because obviously you wouldn't put those on a passenger plane. Things like livestock, things like racehorses, Formula One cars. Much of the dangerous goods are carried on freighter-only aircraft, primarily because they are dangerous. And then you have the outsize freighters. These would be the super guppies, as you might know them. These have the capacity to transport massive pieces of equipment, such as tube rolling stock, so train rolling stock, aircraft wing components, etc., etc. So these are huge super freighters, if you like. So the busiest trade routes, well, I already alluded to this when I was speaking about where the busiest airlines are. So the busiest trade routes now, much of Europe, much of America is kind of saturated in terms of the levels of demand. So the demand is still high, but we're not generating new routes and new cargo. This is because the middle class disposable income levels are sustainable and stable. Whereas if you look at places like China, Asia, Latin America, these kind of places are generating much more cargo demand because the income levels of these populations are slowly changing. So the demand for air freight is going up because the demand for consumerism is going up. So it's interesting how cargo and its development is linked to social trends, demographic trends, and economic trends, and you wouldn't have necessarily thought that. Okay, so then before we close, I'm just going to focus on a few key areas. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to pull out the biggest ones that are kind of threatening the development within aviation and air cargo. So obviously, the big one is economic turbulence. So you go through periods of economic depression and recession, and that obviously affects the demand for goods, and that will affect trade. At the moment, we've got quite high-profile political constraints and considerations. The Ukraine situation, the Gaza situation, not only is that impacting demand, but it's also impacting things like supply chains, which means that commodities can't get in and out of places to build the products that the air cargo industry is transporting. And also it's affecting how and where the air cargo industry can fly over countries. So it's affecting where the aircraft can get to places, and this is adding time and distance onto the air cargo journeys, which is adding to the cost, which if you link back to the first definition of air cargo and what logistics is, acceptable cost was one of the criteria, and this is why this is a big problem. And then if we look at something like competition, one of the big problems that the air cargo industry has at the moment is it kind of goes through cycles. So historically, the big airlines like British Airways, Lufthansa, Emirates, they are all what we call legacy carriers. So they are established carriers. And then they would be carrying the cargo, and then came along the integrators, which are people like FedEx, people like UPS and DHL. So UPS, DHL, etc., they have their own trucks, they have their own aircraft, they operate their own airport, which is distinctly different from the airlines who don't do that. And these are big competitors to the airline industry. So that's what we had in the recent past. And now you've got people like Alibaba and Amazon who are kind of prodding these integrators and providing much more competition to them, and the legacy carriers as well. And they've got their own hubs. They're moving into the drone market, the very small parcel industry, and they're encroaching quite a lot of profit margins and market share from not only the integrators but also from the legacy carriers. And then you've got something called GATT, which is around about halfway down on the right-hand side. This is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. This is what the governments around the world agree on how many goods can come in from each country, and these are agreed annually, and this obviously affects how much air cargo of a different type comes in. So for example, restrictions on steel, restrictions on cars, restrictions on electrical equipment, etc. So these are some of the big industry challenges that air cargo is facing. Technology and investment we've already spoken about. The only other thing I'd say is that airport growth and infrastructure issues, not so much an issue in the Middle East and Asia, because they have a very supportive government that are pushing airport development and aircraft development. China has a policy at the moment of investing in and building 250 new airports, whereas the UK and its planning and infrastructure struggles to build a new runway, and we don't have the space to build a new airport specifically. Within this, the demand for air cargo is also restricted by the fact that Heathrow Airport is operating at around about 98% capacity. So even if you wanted to add new cargo routes, the problem is accessing the runway, because there isn't the slots there to get the aircraft airbound and into Heathrow Airport itself. So these are some of the bigger issues which we will explore throughout the module. And just to finish off, a lot of my students laugh at me when I say to them at the end of the module that they will end up loving boxes. And cargo isn't necessarily in the forefront of people's mind when they join an aviation programme. And they often come to the module without any expectation, without any knowledge. And once they've had the module, they realise how dynamic the industry sector is. And many of them have gone on to forge quite successful careers within air cargo. And these are just some of the successful recent graduates that we've had. So I'll leave you with that.